Hi everyone, welcome to Doing Sociology. Today we have with us Radhika Govindrajan. Well, she teaches in the Department of Anthropology, University of Washington. She is a cultural anthropologist who works across the fields of multispecies ethnography, environmental anthropology, gender and sexuality, the anthropology of religion, South Asian studies, and political anthropology. Her first book, Animal Intimacies, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018, and by the Penguin Random House in India in 2019, is an ethnography of multi-species relatedness in the Central Himalayan state of Uttarakhand in India. She is currently working on 3 research projects. The first, a book tentatively titled Sex and the Village, Scandals and the Nature of Rurality in Contemporary India, explores how sex scandals in rural Uttarakhand provide an occasion for people to offer multiple, often conflicting theories about the changing nature of rurality and the rural. The second project draws on ethnographic and archival work in Uttarakhand to explore how democratic politics in contemporary India is being constituted anew through emergent discourses and practices of more than human sociality, relationality, and responsibility. The third project is concerned with the relationship between elections and broader social life and examines how electoral discourses and practices and ordinary forms of sociality shape each other in rural and small town Uttarakhand. Radhika, I welcome you to this discussion and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just wanted to, again, affirm what a wonderful project Doing Sociology is. And I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with the two of you. So thank you.
Right. So to begin with, could you talk a little bit about your field site of Uttarakhand in terms of its specificity and relevance? Because, you've been working on it for quite some time now.
Yeah, I wanted to begin by saying that this is such a great question because I think it's slowly changing, but in so much, in particular, Anglo anthropology, there is always a sense that a call for context is often an imposition, right? That it dampens theory rather than actually letting theory unfold from the ground up and rather than actually providing theory. So I really appreciate the opening question to speak to context. So I there are lots of things that I think speak to the specificity and the relevance of Uttarakhand, but maybe one way to get into that question is to start with how I started working in the region and on these questions. So my master's degree was in history, and I was interested in thinking about wildlife conservation, and I was working on the formation of Corbett National Park for one of my MA thesis papers at JNU. And I was interested in understanding how ideas of conservation were legalized, but also how the kind of ideological edifice of conservation came to be. And when I started my PhD, I felt that some of the questions that I had taken up in my master's thesis were really resonant in the region even today. Questions about access, questions about racism and post-colonial conservation and the ways in which it continues to racialize people who live alongside forests as being wild and in need of policing, right? And animals in need of, as these beings in need of protection. So I think Uttarakhand has this very kind of long history of wildlife conservation and the effects that's had on people's access to resources, but also their everyday lives. That is very significant. And those kinds of questions continue to burn in the mountains even today, quite literally, where the forest department has a long history of contention with villagers. And so that's one kind of contextual detail that I think was really significant when I started working there. The other context that I think has been important to the book and to the questions that framed the book are questions of caste and gender. And I'll speak to gender first and then come to caste, which I think is also tied to the creation of Uttarakhand as a state. One of the things that is really central to the book is thinking about how gendered labor shapes interspecies relatedness. And the region that I worked in within Uttarakhand specifically had a particular set of gendered arrangements of labor because of particular kinds of histories. So that region is very fruit heavy, right? It's part of Kumaon's fruit belt. And so a lot of the kind of agrarian output is around fruit, and most other cultivation is usually for subsistence or for sale in small markets. And there was a huge agrarian crisis that is very long-standing, but was certainly very apparent when I was doing field work. And it's hugely complicated. It's tied to multiple things. I think now there's often a tendency to frame it solely in terms of climate, but I think there were other kinds of issues, which is migration, a lack of labor in the mountains, human-wildlife conflict, but also just a desire to get away from agrarian labor, which was understood as marking people as backward, as incapable of being citizens of a modern state. And because of that kind of agrarian crisis, what I saw was really women handling the bulk of agrarian labor, which was usually tied to the jungle, right? So there was the sense that women were responsible for bringing in fuel, firewood, oak, and they were responsible entirely for raising animals. So jungle and janwar ka kaam was considered very much the domain of women. And so that particular set of gender arrangements where men, for instance, in this part of Uttarakhand were not participating in agrarian labor really shaped these questions of interspecies relatedness that I was interested in. And then the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is how caste plays out in these interspecies relatedness and how they shape one another in particular ways. And Uttarakhand is an interesting state because the population in the hills is dominant upper caste. It's Thakur and Brahmin. And so with the demand for the state in itself, as Emma Maudsley, the geographer, has really kind of painstakingly demonstrated, was tied to a certain kind of caste anxiety, right? So there was a fear that with the Mandar reservations in particular, people in the mountains who were dominant caste would not be getting jobs, and that those government jobs would be going to people from outside, right? But particularly people who were lower caste, oppressed caste people. And so that kind of anxiety that was one of the nodes that fed into the creation of Uttarakhand, I think plays out particularly in caste relations in an everyday way. And so I was interested in thinking about how relationships with animals become a way of doing caste oppression in everyday ways. So I think about this in terms of the consumption of pork, for example, in the book, and people, the ways in which upper caste people would often associate Dalit Jatis with the consumption of pork or the consumption of buffalo, but also with the rearing of pigs. But I'm also interested in how particular kinds of stories allowed and permitted forms of challenging these structures of caste oppression, which I'm happy to talk about later. But thinking through that relationship between caste and interspecies relatedness, given that larger history of Uttarakhand, was really important to me. And a thing that's tied to that is also just the ways in which Pahadi politics has developed since the creation of Uttarakhand as a state. So one of the other nodes that fed into the creation of Uttarakhand was the idea that the hills were a quote unquote internal colony, right? And Shekhar Pathak writes about this a lot, of Uttar Pradesh, and that they were not being developed because they functioned as a source of resources for the plains. And that has produced a particular kind of politics in the mountains, which is really about trying to put Pahadis first and takes up these anxieties around outsiders who are present in the mountains. And I write about multiple kinds of outsiders who are present in the mountains in the book rather. But that I think was also really central to what I was finding, particularly when it came to these anxieties about translocated animals, especially monkeys, right? So there were constantly these fears that were circulating in the mountains that monkeys were being dropped off in the mountains to take Pahadi people off the land. And this sense has come up in other contexts. Nanika Mathur writes about how people would say the same about leopards, right, that were translocated to the mountains, or bears, for example. But I also have been thinking a lot over the last decade about how that politics of victimhood has also been marshaled by right-wing politics in the state. So the other context really is the rise and entrenchment of Hindutva politics in the mountains. And, as we're speaking today, there was these incidents of mob violence in a small town in Uttarkashi, where there have been these Muslim-owned shops have been broken, have been damaged. There are posters up all over town asking Muslims to leave. There are fears about love jihad. You might remember that the Haldwani railway case, right, which was framed by a lot of Pahadis as an example of land jihad. The idea that these Muslims from elsewhere are settling in what is a mountain state to take over Pahadi identity. So I also have been thinking about how that particular kind of politics of resistance, right, against a rapacious developmentalist state has also been kind of taken up and fed into this other kind of very violent, ugly politics. So that's something that I think is also important context. So maybe I'll stop there. I think, all of these questions are of relevance to sites outside of Uttarakhand. The question of right-wing politics, for example, the question of gendered labor, what an agrarian crisis has meant in terms of certain gendered arrangements, but also larger familial arrangements and migration. And I think those questions resonate outside of Uttarakhand.
Right. Radhika, in your work, you've used the concept of relatedness to look at the relations between lives in the state of Uttarakhand. So if you could, tell us about that. How do you use the concept of relatedness?
Okay, thank you. I use the concept of relatedness drawing on the work of the anthropologist Janet Karsten, who did a lot of her work in Malaysia. And she argues that relatedness allows for an accounting of more nebulous forms of connection that don't necessarily fit within the idea of kinship, right? And one of the points she makes, and that other scholars of kinship have made, is that kinship itself is not a natural term, right? It's not a neutral term. It has a particular history that is often tied to blood and biology, which in itself is a situated concept. So relatedness is a way of sidestepping the kind of baggage of kinship and the expectations of blood and genetics that come with it, despite efforts to complicate the term. And I find relatedness really useful, particularly because it is so nebulous, and it allows for you to explore very different kinds of connection that might not be glossed as kinship, but that feed into perhaps in moments certain forms of kinship. But for me, I think the reason to use relatedness and that in its larger sense was because it came up everywhere when I was doing fieldwork. So people would constantly talk about how they were tied to animals, right, in particular ways. So there was a lot of the language of hum bandhe hain, right? Or, hamare itihas ban gaye hain, our histories have been tied together, our lives have been tied together, we are tied together. And so I use that language of knots of relatedness. Which also allows me to think about relatedness as something that is naughty in the sense of also being troubled and fraught. And again, this is something that Karsten brings up in her work that I find really useful, which is that studies of kinship have often tended to think of the term as kind of warm and fuzzy. And that really is the everyday sense of it, right? People will hear kinship, and the immediate assumption is that kinship is something positive, or that it connotes a certain kind of mutuality and affinity. And I think what Karsten pointed to was really the dark side of kinship. And I think that's something that relatedness also allowed me to do. And thinking about naughtiness in particular and knottedness in particular allowed me to do. So I also want to think about mutuality, but also this kind of the violence of relatedness. So I talk about mutuality specifically by thinking through questions of labor and gendered labor in particular. So throughout the book, I argue that one major terrain upon which relatedness emerges between some humans and some animals is these relationships of labor that they participate in, right? And particularly the ways in which women have to provide care for animals, and the forms of intimacy and love and exasperation that they come to feel during that. But I'm also interested in historical forms of connectedness. So I'm thinking about, for example, conservation projects, right? And how in one of the chapters of the book, I traced the story of this pig who went wild. She ran away from the Indian Veterinary Research Institute, that is a research institute that does work in animal disease in the region. And there were lots of people who worked for the IVRI, and villages around that forest told me about a pig who had escaped in the 1960s or 70s. And they would say she had lots of children in the forest, and those children are the ancestors of the wild boar you see here today, right? So one could call it a kind of conspiracy theory, but I think it was actually really speaking to how wildness is something that is very unstable, right? It's not something that is a pure fixed state, but a pig can become wild once she escapes human control. So I was also interested in, and they would talk about how, that kind of weird history of conservation has bound them now in ways where they are unable to actually shoot the descendants of what they believe was a domestic pig. And so those kinds of historical conservation politics and how those lives were bound up together in that way is also another kind of form of relatedness that I'm thinking through. But also, it's very hard to speak of kinship in this moment and not speak of the ways in which kinship is weaponized in the service of a fascist politics. And so, there's also this question of the cow mother, right? In the politics of cow protection is very much about Gau Mata, the mother of the nation, which is a claim to kinship. And that claim to kinship then works to exclude others who are incapable of that kinship through violence. And so for me, it was impossible not to think about violence and the violent side of kinship. And caste is another site where I think through this, where caste oppression in many ways was legitimized and authorized by upper caste through claims to kinship with certain kinds of animals, right? So they would say, for example, anyone who eats beef is not worthy of membership in this community of Hindus, but there were also other ways in which proximity to certain animals, particularly pigs, came to be read as a marker of oppressed or lower caste status, right? And so for me, again, thinking through the ways in which caste violence and caste oppression is bound up in these questions of relatedness was also really important. So relatedness allowed me to work across these multiple terrains at the same time, to think about care and mutuality and love at the same time as thinking about violence in its multiple manifestations.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I was unmuted. Okay, so how does relatedness exceed the human in its everyday doings in Kumaon? What is multi-species kinship in this context?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that comes back to one of the central claims of the book, which is that we have to think about non-human animals as individuals with their own very rich histories and biographies, but also as rich emotional beings who are capable of making claims on others. And so for me, one of the questions that often comes up is, well, how do you know, isn't it anthropomorphizing to claim that animals themselves feel a sense of relatedness? And I'll talk about anthropomorphism a little later. But I was interested in understanding how it was that people felt that animals were making claims on them, claims that were rooted in a kind of relatedness, right? And this was not just a sense of projecting relatedness onto animals, but something that came from the behavior of particular animals. And so I write a lot about how people would talk about goats that would follow them. A woman would talk about a goat who would follow her everywhere, and she said, he loves me more than my son. And there was this kind of sense of pride. But he would go and sit with her at any meeting she went to. So if she went to a panchayat meeting, the goat would come with her and sit there, and people would laugh and say, why aren't you tying your goat up? And she would say the goat escapes. So those forms of kind of agentive individual behavior were really meaningful to people when they said this animal is establishing a sense of connection and intimacy and mutuality with us. But I think what was interesting to me is what kinds of ethical possibilities that opens up, right? So if you feel that a claim is being made upon you, how do you respond to that claim as a human? And that, to me, is one of the kind of interesting terrains that is opened up by thinking about relatedness as something that is not just extended by humans, but also extended by animals. So people would talk about how, for example, I write in a chapter on sacrifice, how sacrifice was a deeply fraught practice, precisely because it entailed killing a being that had made these claims to relatedness upon you. And I'm happy to talk about sacrifice and its ethics and politics a little later, but I think that's one of the ways in which thinking about relatedness is something that is beyond the human and beyond a gesture that humans offer is really important. And I think it also forces us to move beyond our own forms of hubris and recognize that other kinds of beings are capable of cultivating and claiming connection in ways that are legible and meaningful to people. And people will talk about that not just in relation to animals and themselves as humans, but also in terms of the claims that animals would make upon themselves. So, they would talk about monkeys, for example, and the claims that they made. One of the stories that I've always found really kind of compelling and powerful is something I talk about in the monkey chapter, where this one grandfather who absolutely loathed the monkeys who he claimed had been dropped off near his orchard from Delhi, he forged this connection with one of the monkeys. So he would spend all day chasing the monkeys off from his orchard, and he had a slingshot and he had stones, and he would curse them all day long because they were really causing a lot of damage to his orchard. But there was this one monkey that I saw him feed one day. He gave her a pear, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "No, she's different from the others." So there was also a sense in which the individuality of those animals and their relationships really allowed these forms of relatedness to emerge in ways that felt mutual, right? And that were not just offered up by the human. There's another sense in which I think relatedness exceeds the human, which is thinking about the gods, right? And, the gods are a huge part of multiple parts of this book. So people would often talk about how they were also bound in these webs of obligation. And again, that idea of being bound, right? And with its sense of mastery in some sense by the gods, because the gods would demand sacrifice, for example, right? Or the gods would require other kinds of obligations to be fulfilled. So one of the things I've written about in other work is how in 2010 there was a lot of debate around sacrifice, and there were attempts to stop the practice. The Uttarakhand High Court intervened in ways that, again, I could talk about later, but a lot of people read the 2013 floods and landslides and cloudbursts in Uttarakhand as a sign of divine predation. And this is, again, something that Menika Mathur has written about in Garhwal. Luke Whitmore has written about in his work on Kedarnath. But that was read as a kind of a calling in to bonds of obligation. So I knew a number of people who immediately went out and sacrificed animals because they believed that, this was the abandoning of sacrifice was one of the ways in which the gods had been angered. So that relatedness is something that also extends beyond the realm of the secular into the realm of the divine. And I think that's something that I've also been thinking through. And finally, in more recent work, there's a piece I've just written on animal ghosts, and that has made me think about relatedness, beyond the kind of the living, right? So not just the divine, but also the ghostly. And that piece, it follows the story of a woman who had sold her bull, or not sold her bull, she'd actually given someone money to take her bull away. And this is part of a kind of complex political economy in the mountains where, especially where I work, which is along these ridges, people don't really practice plow agriculture, right? So bulls are useless in this kind of landscape. And so the question of what to do with bulls when they're born is a really fraught one. And now people are actually paying others to take their bulls away. And there's this sense of ignorance around the encounter. And, James Staples actually writes very nicely about the forms of ignorance that people participate in when they're participating in these meat economies. But a lot of people will pay someone and say, okay, you're taking this bull to work on your farm, right? And the person will say, yes, of course. And then they might abandon the bull. So if you drive on the highways in Uttarakhand at this point, you'll see just huge numbers of abandoned bulls. And I just came back a few days ago and I saw several dead bulls on the highway that had also been killed and eaten by leopards, right? And so this story is actually is the impetus for that piece, where this woman who I was traveling with and whose house I've lived in for very long saw a bull that was half eaten, and she was certain that it was a bull that she had sold to somebody, and that person had abandoned them. And then she was haunted by the bull, and nobody there was willing to believe that the bull had haunted her, right? So there was this kind of dissonance where people said, bulls don't come back as ghosts. What are you talking about? And she said, no, I'm telling you, I'm being haunted by this bull because he had a really angry personality. And now that I've seen him, he knows that I know, right? And I did wrong by him. And so I've been interested in thinking about what forms of accountability might happen from beyond the realm of the living. And I think of this as a kind of call for spectral justice. So that's another way in which I think relatedness is beyond the human, right? In a sense.
Right. And we're also talking about animals. So, do you think that animal sacrifice plays a role in creating kinship relations between humans and non-humans?
Yeah, that's a great and kind of fraught question. It's a provocative claim. But I think for me, what was interesting when I started doing fieldwork, it was 2009-10, and that was when the contestations around animal sacrifice had really gathered steam. So there were lots of animal rights groups in the region that were approaching the High Court, but they were also going to temples in the region and taking videos of Hindu gurus, so Baba Ramdev, for example, and saying, Baba Ramdev would say, sacrifice is not a actual practice within Hinduism. any reference to sacrifice is symbolic. It just meant the sacrifice of a coconut or the sacrifice of flowers. Phool patti bhi bali hoti hain, right? That kind of language of trying to get away from the idea that sacrifice is ritually significant. And so for me, what was really interesting was thinking through how people who were continuing to practice sacrifice in the face of all these attempts to stop it, right? Legal, religious, social, how they were thinking about the significance of the practice. And in particular, as I write in the book, I was really struck by how many women framed sacrifice to me as an act of interspecies kinship, right? That sacrifice was made meaningful because there was relatedness between animals. So the idea that why would you give the gods something that is not meaningful, right? Something that is not significant, because a sacrifice is something that hurts. And so a lot of the women would talk about how much it would hurt, not just economically, but actually just affectively, to sacrifice animals that they had raised. And at the same time, that act of sacrifice would then deepen connections between the animal who was sacrificed and the family on whose behalf it had to give up its life, right? Or on whose behalf its life was taken. And so, or his life was taken, because it's always male animals. So for me, it was really trying to think through, okay, what kinds of arrangements make such claims possible? And this is where I really come back to that emphasis on gendered labor, because women would spend hours raising these animals, right? And it was actually like bodily breaking work. You know, something women would talk about constantly, the idea that their bodies had been broken by the labor of caring for animals, that they would carry oak up every day to provide litter, right? They would actually carry fodder, they would carry grass, they would carry other kinds of things that animals might like to eat. They would take them out to graze for hours in the day. The act of the care labor was something that they foregrounded constantly. And so I think of it not just as care, but also as care labor, right? That the labor is productive of forms of connection that are not pure, right? So they're not love in a kind of pure sense, but they're obviously very material, they're very self-interested in some ways, but they were very meaningful to these women. And they would talk a lot about the forms of intimacy that they felt with animals through this care labor. And so it was a really interesting moment also for me to recognize that it was women in particular who were calling for sacrifice to be recognized as a practice that emerged from their labor, right? In some ways, the sacrificial arena is deeply male, right? So the sacrificer at temples in particular is always male. Women are watching from some distance in most temples. And then, you know, the meat is often cooked by men when it's brought back home. But it was interesting to me to see how women were sort of laying claim to sacrifice being meaningful and being powerful and productive through their labor. And I argue that there were again, this question of what kinds of ethical and political possibilities emerge from this is something that I've been really interested in. So I talk about what kinds of partial, fraught, incomplete ethics emerged from these acts, right? And so one of the stories that has really stayed with me is of this young woman who I know very well. And she called me one day and she said, you know, will you come to the temple with me? And she was going up to the temple of the livestock deity Eri, and that's not a temple you usually go to unless you're offering milk from a cow that's just given birth, right? Or some other kind of ritual associated with the birthing process. So we went up and she did this little private ritual, and I asked her, what is the ritual for? And she said, I dreamt about this goat that my family had sacrificed many years ago, and he was a goat that I was very close to. I would take him grazing, and I just wanted to do something for his memory in that way, right? And I think of that as a form of connection that, again, extends beyond death and that is made meaningful by death. I want to stress that this is not an ontology, right? In the sense of being something that is stable, something that is fixed, or something that is universally accepted. I think of the sacrifice and kinship as something that is a kind of ongoing practice, right? Something that people work through every day, and something that's really fraught. So I also don't want to romanticize this, right? I wanted to take these claims seriously, but I also wanted to give space to those who were skeptical of such claims, and who believed that it was violence beyond the pale, right? And that this was not actually a claim to kinship. So that's one of the tensions in the chapter. What do you do with people who are claiming, well, these are just false self-serving claims to kinship, when ultimately you're not willing to kill your own children, so you kill something that substitutes for your child, right? Someone that substitutes for your child. And I think women were really trying to respond to that ethical critique, but they were also aware of the ethically fraught nature of this. And so I think for me, that's where relatedness is at its most powerful, right? When it's not satisfied, when it's not complete, when it remains an open, fraught kind of project, and you have to constantly work through the ethics of it. And that is for me where you can think of sacrifice as an interspecies relationship.
Right. How does interspecies relatedness emerge from individual bodies living alongside each other and the intracorporeal intimacy that they afford?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the individuality, again, as I said earlier, has been really important to me because I think, obviously one kind of, I don't want to stress just bodily connection. There were other kinds of connection that happened even in the absence of bodies. So in the chapter on bears and this genre of talk about bears who have sex with women, I talk about how, the absence of bears was also meaningful, right? Even though you weren't constantly encountering individual bear bodies, there was a sense of how that relatedness was meaningful, even in the absence of a kind of physical material body. But for the sacrifice question specifically, I think a lot of the connection was intercorporeal. One, as I mentioned, there was the actual kind of bodily labor of raising animals, which involved constant kind of intercorporeal exchanges, right? So whether it's, women just sort of constantly absentmindedly rubbing stuff off their goat's back, right? Or like taking a body on, trying to navigate what it means to be in the same kind of bodily horizon as another body. And that's a term that I borrow from Sarah Ahmed. That connection between individual bodies was really meaningful. So in one case, for example, I watched this woman who was trying to help her goat give birth. And she had to reach in to kind of help the kid come out. Right. And it was such a visceral moment, quite literally. She was covered in all these bodily fluids. And it was such a powerful moment for her too, where, she was like, oh, I helped do this. But it was also a very everyday moment. And I think that those kinds of connection between bodies and between individuals was also what made certain forms of relatedness really significant, because you were actually in this body's horizon, right? You were open to that body in particular ways. And again, for me, the question of what kinds of ethics emerge from that was really central to the sacrifice chapter, but also to the chapter on cows, where I argue that, people who raised cows and let them go would often talk about how that labor was central to the ethical messiness of what it meant to relate to an animal, right? That you were doing that labor for them because that laboring relationship is born from capitalism. So you're not laboring for the cow in the abstract. You're laboring for the cow because the cow is a being who you have worked into this business arrangement, right? So a lot of women would talk about how cows were central to their karobar, for example, right? And that, again, that form of intercorporeal exchange was their way of both sort of trying to account for that labor, right? So the forms of care that they would talk about, the forms of kind of loving intimacy they would talk about with particular animals was a form of accounting for what they understood as being a certain kind of unfree labor, right, on the part of the cow. But as I write elsewhere, they also saw their own labor in some ways as unfree, right, marked by this kind of patriarchal system where the burden of labor was upon them. And that, I think, also allowed for certain kinds of connection to emerge between bodies in ways that opened up certain kinds of ethical possibilities.
Okay. So I've been actually thinking about this question for a long time. So it's a good opportunity to ask you. Do you think that your work and other new works challenge the traditional ideas of kinship that we often talk about in terms of either sociology or anthropology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the anthropology of kinship is such a rich field. And I think that some of that work in challenging traditional conceptions of kinship has actually gone back such a long time that I prefer to think about some of this work as building upon and extending rather than challenging. I think there have been so many challenges that, it's very hard to think of kinship as purely biology anymore. And that that kind of work has come from work in queer kinship, for example, right, that has really taken on the family and challenged the idea that the family is a locus of kinship, and also to think about cultivated forms of kinship. It's also come from other kinds of sites where, for example, the use of the language of kinship by particular kinds of states or communities. So again, speaking to that idea of the dark side of kinship. But I think the language of kinship and how it takes form is something that we have to be attentive to in situated context, right? And I think the fact that it comes up in so many places, I feel like so many multi-species ethnographers who work on South Asia have been thinking through the language of kinship, whether it's a work of Anu Jale, Ambika Yodurai, so many others that I'm leaving out right now. And I think it's because that language is so resonant across multiple sites that we work in. So for me, really trying to think through kinship in a productive way comes back to that question that you were asking at the start, right? Which is about context. How is the language of kinship mobilized? What are its particular arrangements? How might those shift over time? So one thing I've been interested in is how is the language of sacrifice as an act of kinship shifting when people are buying goats, right, rather than raising them. And I addressed that as well, saying that there are other forms of kinship that might emerge from a more fleeting encounter. But I think we have to be attentive to how those languages work through, how they shift, but also how they're mobilized, right, and are open to being mobilized. And this is, again, something that I'd mentioned at the start, but sometimes productive languages of relatedness can become roped into violent projects, right, in particular ways. And I think we have to be really attentive to those kinds of workings on the ground. And I hope my work can contribute in that way, I think. So not so much challenging, but really taking all those insights and then thinking also with insights from Uttarakhand and from where I work in terms of what work kinship does.
Okay. So last question. What do you think are some of the challenges, be it, ethical or methodological, that a researcher might face when they're doing an ethnography of this kind?
That's, again, a really great question, and one that remains kind of open for me. So, I might ramble a little because I think I'm still thinking through some of these questions. One of the methodological, and I think it's also an ethical question, has been, how do you deal with anthropomorphism, right? And there have been lots of conversations around whether animal studies or multi-species ethnography or the more than human turn are really about humans in the end, right? It's about human interests. It's about non-humans insofar as they relate to humans, right? So they're still bound within the realm of the human. And there have been some conversations about what it would mean to think about these questions in ways that are not wrapped up in the human. And I think that's always a kind of productive question. To what extent are these questions still trapped in a certain kind of humanistic or a human exceptionalism? But for me, I think one of the methodological possibilities of this work is thinking through instinct and imagination. And I draw on the work of several scholars who really try to push what it means to be playful and imaginative when it comes to writing about non-humans. And I'm thinking specifically, of Brian Masumi's work on instinct. And one of the things he argues is that animals and humans human and non-human animals rather share instinct, right? We're all instinctive beings. So what does it mean to then claim, for example, that animals cannot act in reasoned ways, right? Something we hear so often, that these are forms of animal instinct. They're not actually reasoned, thought out, intellectual actions or processes. And so, Masumi says, what would it mean to lean into instinct as a human quality, right? To not just think of the human as a intellectual, cultivated, reasoned being, but as an instinctual being, and what might that open up? And so for me, I think one of the methodological challenges and possibilities is what it means to work through instinct, right? To think, okay, well, yeah, actually what I'm seeing here is this sense of connection that an animal is making with a human, for example. What would it mean to write that claim in ways that I can't actually confirm, right? But I think also this gets back to so many questions that have been asked of ethnography with humans, right? Which is, how do you know? I mean, at what point are you not projecting your own thoughts, or what is someone holding back from you, right? How do you fully know someone else? So I don't think these are exclusively questions that should concern multi-species ethnographers. I think these are questions about knowledge production, representation, politics, voice, that have been really profound and kind of fraught, again, for anthropologists and sociologists for very long, right? And so for me, the challenge is really, how do we think about these when we extend them beyond the human? Another person whose work I really enjoyed in this is Jane Bennett, who's really kind of said, well, maybe we should allow more room for the imagination to play here, right? And not think about this as just a kind of objective methodological form, but something that is more creative, something that's more open, something that's more playful. And I've tried to, I think, work with that and through that. And it's tricky because I think it leaves you again open to certain kinds of objections. And one objection that I've encountered on several occasions is really like, are animals actually consenting to their own exploitation, right? Because of relatedness. So what choice does a cow have when her milk is taken from her? Or what choice does a goat have when they're sacrificed? And I think these are really important questions that continue to kind of haunt me and disturb me. And so for me, that's one of the methodological challenges. What are the limits of the imagination? At what point is imaginative possibility still wrapped up in human concerns? But how do you kind of move past or move through that, right? I don't think you can move past it, but how do you move through that in ways that still speak to the creative, agentive, emotional capacities of non-human animals? And this is where I found Frans de Waal's book really, really powerful. He has this great book called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And the book is really a challenge to what he calls anthropodenialism, right? And he says, what is the form of hubris that allows humans to argue that they're the only beings with capacity for reason or capacity for emotion, and that all other beings act from instinct? So it's the opposite direction of Masumi in some sense, right? Even though they come to the same kind of conclusion. And he points out that, that there are these very rich emotional lives that animals lead, and that we're perfectly open to recognizing that in everyday context. But when it comes to academic writing, somehow that dries up, right? And then these questions of, well, is this anthropomorphism emerge? And I find that really powerful, actually. I mean, I found memes on the internet such a great space for thinking about exactly this recognition of animals as creative, right? And the ways in which people are constantly recognizing that animals act with agency, with humor, with creativity, with love, with intention. And so I think if we're open to that in our everyday lives, and I'm a huge animal meme sharer, I think there's something about letting that wall down in our academic writing and being open to that, with the possibility that, that you are speaking for. But again, that's, as I said, a concern across sociology and anthropology at large. These questions of representation are really central. I think another ethical problem I've been grappling with is how do we think about projects of human and animal liberation, for lack of a better word? But I think liberation is actually a good word because it's aspirational in that sense too. But how do we think of them together? And this is the particularly fraught question in India right now, where animal rights the discourse of animal rights has been so weaponized and hijacked by the right wing that it's very hard to make any kinds of claims that do not get immediately wrapped up in certain kinds of discourses, right? So if you look, for example, even at the websites of prominent animal rights organizations, sometimes you'll find content that totally feeds into these ideas, particularly about Muslims, right, as cruel towards animals. So how does one think about a politics that recognizes these multiple kinds of liberatory projects? And this has been a real struggle, and I found, I think, a lot of inspiration in the work, particularly of Black and Indigenous feminist scholars and anti-caste scholars who've been thinking through how these questions are deeply entangled, but that they but who also caution against immediate points of comparison. So Benedict Bosseron, who has this wonderful book called Afro Dog, writes that, sometimes the politics of comparison, right? And she begins with this ad campaign by an animal rights organization that said animals are the new slaves. And she said, what is the new slaves, right? Does that mean that the old slaves are gone, right? That question has been addressed. And now we're moving on. That kind of postness, right, of the post-human is something that they're calling upon scholars who work in that tradition to interrogate. And she argues that one can suggest that histories of animality and animal oppression and human oppression are connected, but that we should be really cautious about comparing them, because the comparison then defangs certain movements for liberation, right? And Zakia Iman Jackson is another person who writes about this quite powerfully. And there's been a lot of work, I think, on whether we can understand humanism or certain claims to humanism as a potentially liberatory project. So, people have been writing about Dr. Ambedkar's humanism, for example, and how that's very different from a kind of Western philosophical humanism that is rooted in the oppression of the animal. So for me, thinking with this work, I've been wondering recently what it would mean to imagine politics that don't seek to enact comparison, right? And who don't say, well, animals are oppressed and they're as oppressed as this particular human group that's being oppressed, because I think that's a really dangerous comparison. But what it might mean to think of these as connected, and what forms of solidarity might look like. So that's been, I think, a really kind of difficult political terrain. And I think a lot of people are dealing with this in very different ways, right? So I think anybody who's doing any kind of multi-species work is navigating how to think about this. But I myself, I think, land on the side of feeling that we have to be really cautious about points of comparison, and also about destabilizing political claims to humanity, right? In this moment, when the humanity of particular minorities and oppressed caste groups in the country is being denied by those in power. So that, I think, is one of the really kind of fraught political things that I've been working through. And as I said, I don't know if I have a solution. One thing that I've been mulling over recently is this piece by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, which is called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it's a really popular piece, and it's being read across multiple contexts. But one of the points they raise at the end is what a politics of solidarity that begins from a place of incommensurability rather than commensurability might look like. So you say, well, actually, these two struggles are incommensurate right now, right? And they're talking about this in the context of indigenous movements for sovereignty in the North American context, and say immigrant rights, right? That these are both valuable projects, but that they're not commensurate, in that the aim sometimes can't be reconciled perfectly. But what would a politics of solidarity look like despite a recognition that these are incommensurable? And I've been mulling over whether that is something that we can work through in this context as well. So yeah, those are two ethical and methodological challenges, although there are so many.
Thank you once again, Radhika, for talking to us. It was a pleasure to hear your insights on doing ethnography in Uttarakhand, particularly on kinship, which is, I feel, at a very crucial juncture in terms of changes. So thank you once again for doing this.
Thank you so much. The book has come out, it's been 5 years since the book came out. So this was a really good opportunity to revisit some of the ideas and to kind of go back to that. So thank you so much for this conversation and for these really wonderful, provocative questions.
I think it's always good to go back to older books and, newer books. So hopefully our readers as well as viewers also go back to the book. And if some of them haven't really seen it already, they should do it now. So thank you, Radhika.
Thank you. Thank you so much.